In a world of conflict hotspots from Eastern Europe to the Middle East, it may have a claim to being the hottest of them all. Right now, tensions in multiple nations around the Horn of Africa are at boiling point. Countries are in flames as the result of civil conflict or staring at one another down the barrel of a gun. Insurgencies are devastating cities, resource wars are tearing apart the countryside, and everywhere cracks are beginning to show. Cracks that point towards what the Sudan War Monitor called a coming regional conflagration not seen since the late Cold War. Yet cast your eye out over most media outlets and there is only silence. While headlines are filled with negotiations over Ukraine, Israeli strikes in Gaza, and the latest thing that Trump has said, few seem to be covering this brewing catastrophe. Hence, this episode, one in which we'll be checking in on the most dangerous conflicts brewing in the Horn of Africa and the countries immediately surrounding it. Conflicts that have the potential to spill over borders and set the region ablaze. The least covered, and potentially most dangerous of all of those, well, that would be the civil war that may be about to erupt in South Sudan. And if you're thinking something along the lines of, hold up, didn't South Sudan already have a civil war? Well, yeah, you'd be right. Between 2013 and 2018, the young country fractured along ethnic lines, with the two main groups, Dinkas and Nuers, slaughtering one another on a grand scale. Somewhere around 400,000 people died before a peace accord was reached between President Salva Kiir and his Dinka faction and the Vice President Riek Machar and his Nuers. But while the agreement stopped the killing, it created a far from stable peace. Aside from demilitarizing the capital, Juba, the main thing the agreement promised was that profits from South Sudan's vast oil fields would be shared between the two men. As regular viewers will remember from previous episodes, that was all fine and dandy until the main pipeline carrying 2/3 of the nation's output ruptured last year, at which point tensions started to rise. South Sudan's pipelines, you see, run across the nation it was once a part of, Sudan. And Sudan itself collapsed into civil war between the army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces in 2023. A civil war that's likely now one of the worst conflicts happening anywhere on Earth. And that conflict made repairing the ruptured pipeline all but impossible. And that in turn meant that President Kiir suddenly had a whole lot less money to pay Vice President Machar's faction off with. The first impacts were felt last November when Kiir embarked on a firing spree, throwing allies out of power in an attempt to keep his slice of the pie. As The Economist noted, the president, quote, feels threatened by his lack of resources. But things really came to a head over the last month. Done purging his own side, Kiir ordered the mass arrest of 22 of Machar's allies. At the same time, the army began operations in the oil-rich state of Upper Nile against civilians from Machar's Nuer ethnic group. What happened next remains deeply controversial. In early March, an armed Nuer group known as the White Army attacked the army garrison in the city of Nasir in Upper Nile state. The base was overrun, and the city fell to the rebels. Back in the Civil War, the White Army fought alongside Machar's forces. Today, it's a live debate whether the vice president has any operational control over them, but in Salva Kiir's mind, that debate is already settled. From the president's perspective, Machar ordered the attack on Nasir, and that required punishment. Just days after the city's fall, Machar's house in the capital Juba was surrounded by forces loyal to Kiir. Machar allies were also arrested, including the deputy chief of the army and the petroleum minister. Perhaps President Kiir hoped to calm things down with a show of force, to cow his enemies into standing down. Instead, the arrests did to the situation what a block of Semtex does to the inside of a clown car. It creates a colorful and horrific mess. In Nasir, the White Army attacked a UN helicopter, killing a South Sudanese general. Days later, the army responded with indiscriminate airstrikes on the city. According to the Sudan War Monitor, quote, incendiary bombs landed around the town's dirt airstrip, burning homes, trees, and brush, and causing civilian deaths and injuries. Separately, a helicopter gunship attacked Lonchok County, which neighbors Nasir to the north. Now, from the point of view of anyone in the Nuer ethnic group, this was an attack on their people, one that visited collective punishment on their community for the actions of the White Army. The very next day, Machar's political party pulled out of the peace process that ended the civil war. As Crisis Group noted of the escalation, quoting here, South Sudan is slipping toward renewed conflict and political upheaval. Should that conflict erupt, it would be spectacular. Despite the shaky truce, tensions have remained high across South Sudan, and the period from 2018 to early 2025 was marked by ethnic massacres in the countryside that killed thousands. Should the starting gun be fired on renewed conflict, far too many are primed and ready to start slaughtering their neighbors. Remarkably, this isn't even the most dangerous thing about the situation in South Sudan. No, that would be the increasing presence of foreign actors, picking sides and then stoking the situation for their own ends. As Crisis Group's project director for the Horn of Africa, Alan Boswell, has noted, when outsiders get involved, local conflicts in South Sudan tend to turn into full-blown war. Sadly, getting involved in South Sudanese affairs is apparently what the country's neighbours are all about. Among these, the most visible may be Uganda, which has deployed special forces to the capital Juba to help prop up Kiir's rule. Since the soldiers arrived, the country's military chief has declared on social media that any move against President Kiir is a declaration of war against Uganda. There are rumours, too, that Uganda's air force carried out the airstrikes on Nasir. Not that this would make them the only foreign military intervening in Upper Nile State. According to Crisis Group, Sudan's army may have clandestinely shipped weapons to Nuer militias in the area, possibly leading to the sudden outbreak of violence. As to why Sudan's military, which, remember, is fighting its own civil war, would want to arm groups opposing President Kiir, well, the answer may lie in who Kiir is friends with. According to the Sudanese media, the president may well be in bed with the Rapid Support Forces. The other side, in Sudan's brutal conflict, the RSF are genocidal, ruthless, and intent on splitting the country in two. While recent counterattacks by the Sudanese army have dislodged them from much of the territory they previously held, they still control vital areas along the border with South Sudan. Crisis Group explains the army wants to, quoting here, prevent the RSF from establishing a secure zone of operations spanning from Darfur in the west through South Kordofan in the south, through South Sudan's Upper Nile to Sudan's Blue Nile State and Ethiopia in the east. Such a corridor would threaten the army's war aim of trying to push the RSF west of the Nile in Sudan and contain it there. When the conflict first erupted in its northern neighbour, Juba did its best to stay neutral. But as time went on, the Sudan War Monitor writes that Kiir's government began trading the RSF much-needed fuel in return for weapons. In recent weeks, the partnership seems to have only gotten deeper. Mid-March saw RSF fighters cross into the border from Sudan and into Upper Nile State, or where the city of Nasir is located. There, they engaged in a 2-day battle with members of Machar's SPLA-IO political party. A battle that seems to have ended with the RSF setting up a permanent presence in South Sudan. So, you now have a situation where Sudan's military may be arming the White Army in its fight against Juba, while the RSF and Uganda move in to prop up President Kiir's rule. And that's before we even mention the potential involvement of the United Arab Emirates, which has set up a field hospital on the South Sudanese side of the border. If your action then was to go, wait, Simon's getting all worked up about a field hospital, is that a good thing? Well, just know that the UAE set up a similar hospital in Chad. A UN investigation found that they then used it to funnel weapons to the RSF, facilitating the paramilitaries as they carried out a genocide in Darfur. So, you can maybe see why the Sudanese army would be wary of UAE field hospitals suddenly appearing along the border with their southern neighbour. Perhaps so wary that they would decide to start arming groups fighting President Kiir. Really though, the why may be the least important part of all of this. After all, the former Sudanese regime of Omar al-Bashir armed anti-Kiir rebels during the last civil war, just like South Sudan funneled weapons to Sudanese militias. These are two complex nations with long, complex, and extremely bitter histories. I mean, you don't fight a war of independence from your old overlord without at least some lingering resentment. No, the important part is what came next. Because the smart money is unfortunately on a return to violence. In their report, Crisis Group laid out two potential steps the White Army and the government in Juba could take next. In one scenario, the White Army, perhaps aligned with other Nuer militias, marches on Malakal, the capital of Upper Nile State. As the report notes, a battle for Malakal would dramatically up the ante. The other potential outcome is for the South Sudanese army to double down on retaking Nasir, stepping up aerial bombardments and perhaps conducting ground operations. Operations that would doubtless be taken as an attack on the Nuer people. With tensions so strained, either of these scenarios could trigger widespread ethnic-based violence across the country. If things really go south, they could lead to renewed civil war. But the true nightmare scenario, the one that keeps regional experts up at night, is one in which a South Sudanese implosion brings the horrors of Sudan's conflict spilling over its borders. Although it gets a fraction of the media coverage of Ukraine or the Middle East, there's a good argument that Sudan's civil war is the worst disaster currently happening anywhere in the world. 150,000 are thought to have been killed. Entire cities have been razed. Over 600,000 people are on the brink of famine. should South Sudan's fragile peace collapse, there is a non-zero chance that both the RSF and Sudanese armed forces will turn the country into a new front in their apocalyptic struggle. Not only would there be a disaster for anyone living in South Sudan, but it would also dramatically increase the chances that other outside actors get pulled in. Uganda already seems raring for a fight, while other neighbors like Kenya might feel forced to intervene. To be clear, none of this is set in stone. Bad as things seem right now, they may not boil over into prolonged fighting. The Conversation, for example, has noted that the rainy season is about to begin, which would make serious armed operations much harder to conduct. But we can't just ignore the threat that is posed by the breakdown between President Kiir and Vice President Machar, a breakdown that could potentially plunge the wider region into a devastating war. Just before we continue, quick plug for our fantastic newsletter. Look, imagine never missing the critical details behind today's global events, those decisive moments and hidden narratives that shape our world. And that's exactly what you'll get with the WarFronts newsletter. Every week, you'll receive expertly curated insights into global conflicts, powerful military strategies, and analysis delivered directly to your inbox. No fluff, no noise, just crystal clear clarity wrapped in compelling stories and fascinating historical connections that you just won't find anywhere else. It's completely free, it's genuinely valuable, and signing up just takes a few seconds. There's a link below. Understanding the world just got a whole lot easier thanks to our newsletter. And now back to it. From South Sudan, we turn to Ethiopia and Eritrea, two African Horn nations with a history of brutal violence and with the potential and apparent will to share a whole lot more. Rather than explain ourselves what's happening between these two nations, we'll quote directly from General Sarkan G. Beyru of the Tigray region, wedged into the Ethiopian north on the Eritrean border. Writing for the Africa Report on March the 10th, General Beyru laid out a warning to the world. At any moment, war between Ethiopia and Eritrea could break out. It will draw in the whole neighboring region, including Sudan, and the security of the Red Sea will be directly affected. Now, Beyru's warning went a good deal beyond that, and the picture that he painted of a region descending into chaos was a dark one to behold. For context, Ethiopia and Eritrea fought in their last war as recently as 2.5 years ago, but that time they were fighting on the same side. Back then, they were fighting against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, an ethnic Tigray nationalist paramilitary organization that took up arms after relations with the Ethiopian government broke down past a point of no return. The war was incredibly brutal, with copious war crimes committed by all sides and an unclear number of dead that's thought to be somewhere above 150,000, but potentially as high as 600,000. The war concluded in 2022 when a peace accord was signed in Pretoria, and Eritrean troops have been parked on a portion of Tigray ever since. But Beyru, the Ethiopian Army's former chief of staff and a veteran of the civil war on the Tigrayan side, is convinced that relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea are about to break down. Quoting again, after the Pretoria Peace Agreement of November 2nd, 2022, the alliance of the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments has gradually deteriorated so much that going to war seems inevitable. Preparations are in their final stages. The nature of preparations for war is such that after a certain stage of the process, it becomes very hard to hold it back. Beyru explains that the point of no return has already been crossed, and worse, he indicates that it will be the Tigray region that will be caught in the middle, becoming a battlefield for Ethiopia and Eritrea to settle their differences violently. According to Beyru, Eritrea is attempting to become a self-sufficient power, quote, that combines the military invincibility of Israel, emulating the economic success of Singapore and the social well-being of Denmark at the same time. To hear Beyru tell it, Eritrea is willing to steamroll Tigray in order to get it, more than happy to exterminate Tigrayans and capture their lands. Beyru notes Eritrea's past mass killings against Tigrayan men of military age, the mass use of brutal sexual violence against women, and more, and he argues that by exploiting Tigrayan leaders who think they can ally with Eritrea to bring down the government in Ethiopia, they're going to get Tigray destroyed. It's an ominous warning, and one that turned heads all across the African continent. But it's a warning that Beyru is not the only one working to amplify. Instability in the Tigray region has been on the rise recently, where the TPLF, the same organization that previously fought Ethiopia and Eritrea, has now fragmented into factions after trying to rule the Tigray region with Ethiopia's blessing. The split within the TPLF is particularly concerning, however, because neighboring Eritrea hasn't been in a position to collaborate with Ethiopia since the Tigray War's end. Eritrea was iced out of the negotiations that brought about a peace deal, and as its ambitious leaders have increasingly turned on Ethiopia's ruling party in Addis Ababa, Eritrea has started looking for Tigrayans with an axe to grind. Now, dissidents who ended up on the disadvantaged side of the split within Tigray's leadership have provided Eritrea the precise people that the nation was looking for, and now with those dissidents beginning to seize towns in the Tigray region, the TPLF leadership in power has accused those dissidents of receiving direct support from Eritrea. In return, dissident factions have levied accusations that the TPLF leadership has sold out Tigrayans. Neither side is backing down. Each side is supported by one of the two nations that holds Tigrayan land, and the entire situation is starting to look a hell of a lot like the setup to a proxy war. The trouble is, in a proxy war between two non-nuclear armed neighbours who each can quite clearly see each other's involvement and who both think they can win in a fight, proxy wars, well, they don't stay proxy for very long. Now, war drums are beating loud in both nations. Eritrea has mobilized its military nationwide as of a month ago, and recently Ethiopia responded with mass forward deployments of its troops toward the Eritrean border. Both Ethiopia and Eritrea refused to talk to the global press about what's happening, and within the last 6 months, the countries have frozen each other's financial assets wherever possible, suspending flights, and Ethiopia has even signed a tripartite security pact with Egypt and Somalia, arraying all three nations in opposition to the Ethiopian government. Each side has levied allegations that the other is attempting to destabilize their administration, and each of them appears confident in their own military's ability to handle the challenges posed by the other. Meanwhile, in the Tigray region, rival factions have taken shape and are now squaring up with the Tigrayan Defense Forces, a massive and formidable organization torn apart by accusations against army commanders who allegedly plotted against the Tigrayan administration. Dissident Tigrayan forces have claimed portions of eastern Tigray, and as regional experts Peyton Noff and Alexander Rondos wrote in their urgent warning via Foreign Policy, quoting here, "The risk of a coup against the administration or the assassination of some of its leaders can no longer be ignored. Any such act would likely serve as a starting gun, kicking off a wave of fighting with the potential to eclipse even what the Tigray region has suffered so far. Nor can we view these rising tensions in a vacuum and fail to look beyond the borders of Ethiopia and Eritrea. The entire African Horn region matters here, not just as neutral observers, but as potential participants that might be willing or even eager to take a side." In fact, Ethiopia has grown very unpopular in the African Horn and the surrounding region over the last couple of years. Since 2023, Ethiopian leader Abiy Ahmed has been adamant that his landlocked nation has a right to sea access, something that's put Ethiopia at odds with Somalia to the south and Eritrea to the north. Ethiopia attempted to work with a breakaway Somali region called Somaliland to get its port access, and Eritreans feared for quite a while that the call would be used as pretext for an attack. Meanwhile, in Egypt, leadership in Cairo has expressed frequent concerns over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which dams the Blue Nile River near the border with Sudan and could, if Ethiopia wished it, choke off critical water access to Egypt, either for its own self-interest or as an act of geopolitical power. Remember, Egypt, Eritrea, and Somalia have now signed a security pact that would seem to array them against Ethiopia in a time of war. And it's here that we find the larger and even more concerning prospect that General Bayrou warned about in his report. For a civil conflict in Tigray to spiral into a regional war that would bring in not just Ethiopia and Eritrea, but the other nations of the African Horn and beyond. Bring those two nations into a conflict, and Egypt and Somalia will come in on the side of Eritrea. Violence from the war in Sudan will spill over, with both the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces eager to try and win allies by taking a side. In a world where the Somali government enters a war, its own breakaway regions may make a play for power or choose a side. All the while, as Bayrou points out, the world is distracted by Gaza, Ukraine, the Congo, and other important conflicts, leaving the question of greater power involvements in an African Horn conflict in the hands of, quote, rich Middle Eastern countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, who will be, quote, the decisive actors to shape the outcome of the war. In a world where the international order seems to be rapidly eroding, those powers could act with near impunity, intensifying a conflict that Noff and Rondos in Foreign Policy warn would, quoting again, destroy what is left of Sudan, destabilize Chad, and create a highway of instability connecting the Sahel to the Red Sea. And all the while, owing both to the critical divide within its own civil society and its geography at the very epicenter of such a conflict, it'll be the region of Tigray that is brought to ruin while playing its part as a battlefield. Are there off-ramps at this stage? Well, maybe. But neither of the sources that we've quoted directly today, and none of the others that we've leveraged in writing this piece, seem to think either side will be interested in taking them. There simply isn't enough political will in Ethiopia or Eritrea to slow down this march toward war compared to the political will invested in accelerating it. There isn't enough restraint or regard for the potential harms in the minds of regional leaders like bin Salman or el-Sisi to let go of the opportunity to exploit a massive conflict and enrich their own nations and inner circles in the process. Elsewhere across the planet, there are no larger powers with the combination of regional influence and political will to even lift a finger to stop what's coming. If they don't, then the entire African Horn may be about to create the most devastating conflict of the entire 21st century so far. Next up, we move southward to the nation of Somalia, where the recent battles against the Islamic State have put the global terror organization on the back foot. At the same time, however, they've also brought the Islamic State's global financing network into sharp relief, raising new insights and new questions around where the group's most dangerous fighters might pop up next. The counterinsurgent action in northern Somalia is a subject that we've covered before on the Situation Room, but we will recap it briefly for viewers who might be unfamiliar. Basically, the autonomous region of Puntland, located on the northeastern tip of the Somali nation, has been engaged in an offensive to eradicate Islamic State fighters for months now. Those fighters belong to a branch called the Islamic State in Somalia, or ISS, and they've been holed up in the highland area of the Puntland region for years now. Because of their relative isolation from government forces there, along with their ability to extort locals for cash and their success in keeping connected to global online networks, the ISS has turned into a very important node within the broader web that is the Islamic State. The ISS sends cash and directives to Islamic State franchises all across the world, planning attacks, funding operations, coordinating recruitment efforts, and more, and they've become a sanctuary for other Islamic State leaders and foreign fighters who flooded into the country after crackdowns in other locations. The group's leader and founder, Abdul Qadir Mumin, is a Puntland native who's thought to have very recently become the global leader of the Islamic State movement, though that's not been verified. He also might be dead, killed by a 2024 airstrike, but that also hasn't been verified. Puntland, however, has been taking the fight to the ISS in the Highlands, rooting them out from areas that have been under their control for up to a decade. Puntland forces have drawn on the support of American air power and coordinated strikes that have cleared the way for pushes by ground forces. Unlike the average soldier of the Somali government in Mogadishu, Puntland forces are highly motivated and quite well trained, and they've been effective in flushing out ISS resistance. From January 1st to the first week of February, Puntland captured 50 ISS outposts and 250 square kilometers, and since then, their success rate has been largely the same. The ISS has had its own moments of success, sweeping in to recapture areas that Puntland forces had vacated after their initial victories and engaging Puntland in large battles that have left hundreds dead. But overall, it's Puntland that's gotten the better of the fighting by a wide margin. Most recently, at the time of writing, Puntland forces reported that they'd killed the ISS chief of drone operations, seized a training camp for ISS snipers amidst the peaks of a mountain range, and uncovered an underground bunker that Puntland believes had been the operational command center for the ISS for years before it having been abandoned in advance of a coming attack. The camp purportedly housed not only a headquarters, but a war room, electricity, ventilation, medical facilities, and a court for ISS to mete out their own brand of fundamentalist justice. Recently uncovered mass graves in the same area suggest that the ISS has taken considerable losses, including some among their leadership. But as we observe the ins and outs of Puntland's success against the jihadists, it's worth stepping back and looking at the larger picture. For as long as they held power, the ISS was a local menace, a nightmare organization for the people living under their rule. At the same time, however, they were a symptom of something much larger. As we've said, the ISS was a sort of leadership hub for the global Islamic State movement, and those leaders, financiers, and foreign fighters living under ISS protection, they chose Puntland for a reason. For a long time now, the nation of Somalia has been whatever you'd call a nation after it passes through failed state status and sort of just continues to deteriorate. Federal officials are very weak, autonomous regions have long lacked the power and international support to stand up to jihadists on their own, and a mix of tribal, social, and other internal divisions make it highly unlikely that any governing body in Somalia can cooperate with any of the others. In that environment, the ISS has been able to leverage its proximity to places like Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Libya, the Sahel, Nigeria, and other places where Islamic State branches hold power. Recruiting and training efforts, the flow of finances, smuggling of weapons and resources, seaborne movement, and more can all hinge around a location like that. And while the ISS has increasingly been denied its base of operations in Puntland, there's a much larger problem. This is not the only place in the world where those conditions are met. Far from it, in fact. And it's here that we're going to introduce another name to the story, Adam Russell. He's an author and researcher on non-state actors. He runs a very, very good Substack account called Between the Lines Research, and recently he's published a multi-part series on the Islamic State's global finance networks, which we're going to draw upon heavily today. As Russell pointed out in the early paragraphs of his series, the Islamic State in Somalia has been instrumental in propping up Islamic State activities across Africa, nations like Uganda, South Africa, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's also transferred funds to Afghanistan, elsewhere in Central Asia, and locations in the Sahel and West Africa. Those funds, sent through an operation overseen by one Abdulweli Mohammed Yusuf, are frequently sent in five-figure US dollar denominations via cryptocurrency transfer to international financial operatives. Often, they're washed in a way by Turkish operatives who can use local cryptocurrency exchanges to bounce money around for a bit until it's hard to trace back to its source. Turkey, by the way, has reportedly arrested over 3,500 suspected Islamic State operatives since 2023, but the challenge continues. That cash is then passed on by local brokers in small amounts to avoid attention. Within those local brokerage systems, that money can slip unnoticed among many millions and billions flowing around local economies, so hard to track that officials would be far better off trying to hunt down Islamic State operatives some other way. Basically, it's a foil to the old adage, follow the money, that frustrates investigators by diverting money into an opaque system before it ever reaches the intended recipients. By the time it's converted to funds in hand, it's off-the-grid money going to off-the-grid people. Puntland is a really convenient base of operations for that sort of thing, for all those reasons that we mentioned before. Operatives feel physically safe enough to conduct their business on Somali soil. The Somali government has neither the ability nor the will to come and hunt them down, and local authorities don't have the same access to global financial tracking capabilities. That's not a situation that the Islamic State will find everywhere, but it isn't unique. Take a nation that we've spoken about at length here on the Situation Room, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There, over 100 local ethnic militias across the country can operate basically with impunity, slipping below the federal government's notice whenever they can and effectively fighting back against weak and demoralized Congolese forces when they have to. Just see the impact of the rebel group M23 over the last few months. Backed by Rwanda, yes, but also more than capable of defending its own territory from Congolese soldiers long before it went on the offensive. There's an Islamic State allied group called the Allied Democratic Forces, which have proven highly resilient to Congolese and Ugandan counterinsurgent operations, and they're holed up in a location where they can access vast natural resources on top of their frequent kidnapping and scam operations. In Mozambique, Russell describes ongoing Islamic State operations in the northern province of Cabo Delgado, quoting here, "A region described as a smuggler's paradise due to its lack of government control, abundance of natural resources, and lengthy coastline with over 30 coastal islands." Here, the local IS branch engages in illicit rosewood smuggling. 30% of the timber logged in Cabo Delgado is at high risk of coming from insurgent-occupied forests. End quote. Chinese buyers are reportedly quite pleased to acquire that rosewood, no matter who it came from, and partially through their purchases, the Islamic State in Mozambique is estimated to raise nearly $2 million in revenue every single month. Other governments across Africa and across much of the world have proven incapable of doing any more than the Congos or Mozambiques. In Nigeria, for example, government forces struggle to rein in Boko Haram in the northeast and have been unable to hunt down what's known as the Furqan Office, an Islamic State branch that provides guidance and funding to local cells and franchises. In Burkina Faso and Mali, a combination of atrocities by government and government-allied forces and atrocities perpetrated by Russian mercenaries have created an environment where even the most bloodthirsty jihadist groups are seen as favorable alternatives. In places like the Central African Republic or Yemen in the Middle East, rebel groups that stick to their territory and mind their business are basically invulnerable. The same could be said for other world nations like Colombia in South America or Myanmar in South Asia, where the federal government is virtually incapable of standing up to powerful non-state actors on pockets of territory they control. All of that is not to say that the Islamic State is headed to Colombia or Myanmar next. But but it is to say that the conditions that the ISS found in Somalia are ones that can easily recreate elsewhere. There's a range of stereotypes and expectations around the way the Islamic State acts, all of them rightfully negative, and most of them informed by the group's time leading a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But the way that the Islamic State used to act is not the way that it acts now. The group is decentralized, asymmetric, leveraging cells in dozens of countries that can operate basically independently, and it's long since learned to give up the apocalyptic idealism of the peak ISIS years, in exchange for ruthless pragmatism to cause the greatest possible damage over time. All that is to say, a group of high-level Islamic State leaders are perfectly capable of finding a new, basically unregulated place to stay, setting up a local base of operations with a few hundred fighters and an internet connection, and staking it out for months or years at a time. That way, the financiers, the leaders, the planners, the trainers, and more can work with all manner of Islamic State affiliates across the world and pass on the responsibility of planning and carrying out attacks to those subordinates. They know to prioritize well-hidden, multi-layered financial operations, they have the means to integrate worldwide franchises into a global network, and they know that there's a difference between the Islamic State groups that make the money, like the ISS did extorting and illicitly taxing the people of Puntland, and the groups that spend their money by launching attacks around the world. Whatever Islamic State leadership ends up doing next, it'll be able to extort other local populations, and if it ends up someplace like the DRC, someplace with pre-existing operations to extract and exploit highly valuable natural resources, then it could make a hell of a lot more than it made in the Somali highlands. The people who lead the Islamic State now rose to their positions because they can play the long game. They're good at it, they understand why they got to do it, and they're perfectly capable of doing it for as long as they need to while carefully selecting the circumstances that will allow them to be most effective. The Islamic State appears to be on its way out of Puntland, and that's a very good thing. But make no mistake, it'll pop up elsewhere, under the same conditions it found in Somalia, with every intention to cultivate its terror cells around the world. And while we will be departing from the African Horn for today's final section, we'll be traveling to a part of the world that's closer to the coastline of northern Somalia than even the Somali capital of Mogadishu. We're talking about the nation of Yemen, just across the Red Sea, where on Saturday, March 15th, a wave of airstrikes rained down across the nation, courtesy of the United States. The airstrike came by way of Operation Prosperity Guardian, a US-led intervention by a Western naval coalition that's been active in the area since late 2023. First started in response to over 100 cumulative missile and drone attacks on trade vessels in the critical Red Sea perpetrated by Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi rebel organization, Operation Prosperity Guardian has earned rather mixed reviews for its performance so far. The airstrikes of March 15th, however, were far more decisive in nature than most of what Prosperity Guardian has achieved so far. The attacks were launched by a US carrier strike group led by the USS Harry S. Truman in a unilateral action carried out by US forces alone, although they did receive aerial refueling support from the British military. Flying all across the nation, American warplanes dropped heavy munitions on a range of targets, including several strikes that reportedly targeted senior Houthi leadership outside Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Several military sites were targeted, as well as a power station near a location where the Houthi organization's leader frequently meets international envoys. According to US officials, the attack was partially targeted to eliminate Houthi leadership, with US National Security Advisor Michael Waltz indicating to the press that, quote, multiple Houthi leaders were targeted and killed. A total of 53 people were reported dead, according to Yemen's Houthi-run health ministry, with a total of 5 children and 2 women among those killed. 98 were injured. The Houthis attempted a retaliation in the wake of the airstrikes, but were not successful. US officials reported that 11 Houthi drones were shot down while targeting America's carrier strike group, and 1 Houthi missile splashed down harmlessly off the Yemeni coast. For the United States, and for particularly the Trump administration, the operation was the target of considerably greater attention than US strikes against the Islamic State had drawn in recent weeks. Trump himself put out a series of statements online around the strikes, including this one, quoting, "To all Houthi terrorists, your time is up and your attacks must stop, starting today. If they don't, hell will rain down upon you like nothing you have ever seen before," said US Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the Red Sea shipping lane, a bit more muted on the following day. "We're not going to have these people controlling which ships can go through and which ones cannot." Trump's Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth, couched the strikes in America's desire to ensure, quote, freedom of navigation. Trump also turned press attention toward Iran, calling on the nation to stop supporting the Houthis right away and threatening retaliation if Iran threatened the US. America's State Department recently designated the Houthi movement as a foreign terrorist organization, laying the legal groundwork to institute sanctions against the regime and take other steps against them. Now, the United States and Global West's campaign against the Houthis, not a new phenomenon, as we've mentioned. The Houthis have launched over 100 attacks against maritime trade and naval vessels since late 2023 in solidarity with the Hamas organization and the people of Gaza over the course of the Israel-Hamas war. The US-led coalition, we mentioned previously, has attempted to respond with a range of projectile interceptions and airstrikes. But despite the numerous Houthi attacks on Red Sea shipping since the outbreak of the Israel-Hamas war, we've got to make one thing clear. By all outward indications, the Houthis didn't actually do anything to immediately precipitate these airstrikes. In fact, ever since Israel and Hamas began their ceasefire in mid-January, Houthi attacks have ceased almost entirely. But we'll have more on that later. Between January the 20th and the date the US carried out its strikes, the Houthis had yet to attack any target in the Red Sea and even released the crew of the Galaxy Leader, 25 people who'd been held captive since 2023 after their vehicle carrier ship was boarded and captured. Houthi forces did shoot down an American MQ-9 Reaper drone, but that's nothing new for the Houthis, and much of the point of using unmanned drones is that so those aerial assets can be expended if necessary. The Houthis' only other attack on Western targets, a February attempt to shoot down an F-16 fighter, had failed. The trouble, however, is that the Houthis have been threatening to resume attacks against Israeli Red Sea traffic in response to recent actions in Israel. Early this month, Israel suspended all humanitarian aid shipments into Gaza in an attempt to pressure the Hamas organization into signing its preferred version of a continuation of their fragile truce. Those ceasefire negotiations, by the way, were discussed at greater length last week in our WarFronts Weekly newsletter, so remember, subscribe to that, it's free. The Houthis made a threat on March the 11th that would resume their operations in 4 days' time. Fast forward by 4 days, and you reach March 15th, the day that the US carried out this most recent wave of airstrikes. The specific targets of those airstrikes are not currently known, but the locations of the strikes were reported by the Houthis in both the capital city of Sana'a and parts of the northern province of Sadr, the center of Houthi fighting power and the heart of the Houthi organization's support inside of Yemen. A large Houthi military facility, as well as spots in 3 other provinces, Hodeidah on the coast and Baida and Marib not far from the capital. Some strikes hit a zone of Sana'a called the Eastern Giraffe, where part of the Houthi organization's political leadership is headquartered and where Houthi military assets are known to be positioned. A later round of strikes hit the province of Damar in the southwest. We mentioned the locations where these strikes touched down because the wide range of locations in the US crosshairs doesn't necessarily reflect what the distribution of Houthi leaders would be at a given time. They do, however, reflect the way that the Houthis have taken to hiding their military assets and keeping them out of view of Western intelligence. Those assets are stored in a highly decentralized way, tucked into a range of locations that wouldn't attract attention via satellite or aircraft imagery, and that's something that led to frustration in the US, Israel, and other Western nations. Preoccupied with affairs in the rest of the Middle East, much of the world has only recently started paying attention to the Houthi rebels after the start of their campaign against Red Sea shipping, and that's been true for intelligence agencies too. Western intelligence sources have indicated off the record for months in conversation with various news bureaus that a large proportion of the suspected Houthi arsenal isn't catalogued, tracked, or even known at all before it shows up in midair, hurtling toward container ships. By the way, we also covered that issue 2 newsletters ago. So, subscribe. Did I mention it's free? The reason that that's important is because the expiration of the Houthis' self-professed deadline to reach a deal with Hamas may have been followed by the repositioning of missiles and drones within the country toward areas where they could be launched. That repositioning would require those assets to be removed from storage, loaded into or onto vehicles in many cases, and moved toward where they would ultimately be launched, creating precisely the sort of movement and traffic that Western intelligence can pick up through aerial imaging. For the Houthis to be ready at the time of their deadline, they would have to start moving their assets a couple of days in advance, giving the US confidence that by the eve of the promised return to hostilities, the munitions that the Houthis plan to fire would have already been in motion. And we need to be very clear here. The conclusions we draw from the combination of timing of these airstrikes, prior threats by Houthi leadership, and pre-existing shortfalls by Western intelligence are speculative in nature and have not been confirmed by any relevant intelligence source. So, take it with a grain of salt. That said, it would reflect the United States' suspected capabilities and limitations when it comes to organizing a preemptive strike on Houthi assets. It would also explain both why these strikes seem to come at the last minute, if the Houthi deadline was indeed what prompted the US to attack, and a lower civilian casualty rate if the United States was targeting observable hubs of militant activity in real time rather than acting on intelligence that may have been incomplete or outdated. And to hear American leadership tell it, this most recent wave of airstrikes is only the beginning. That's a promise made by the US Secretary of Defense and echoed by anonymous sources interviewed by the press, who've indicated that strikes may go on for weeks. American officials have explained that the strikes will continue until the Houthis end attacks on Red Sea shipping. Again, an odd choice of verbiage considering that those attacks had been stopped since January, but perhaps explained if a new round of attacks had been imminent. Said the Secretary of Defense, quote, "The minute the Houthis say we'll stop shooting at your ships, we'll stop shooting at your drones. This campaign will end, but until then, it will be unrelenting." America's rhetoric has been backed up with action. On Monday, March the 17th, the US launched another round of airstrikes against the port city of Hodeidah and the northern government of Al-Jaf. At the time of writing, further details on their round of airstrikes are not yet known, but we would hazard a guess that those details and a log of additional airstrikes in the following days will be available by the time this episode is published. The Monday attacks were condemned by the Houthi rebels as a war crime, with the organization's leader offering a rebuttal that seemed to strongly imply a new cycle of escalation. Near directly echoing the United States' demand for the Houthis to stop attacks so that the US could stop the airstrikes, the Houthi leader declared, quote, "If they continue their aggression, we will continue the aggression." The Houthis again attempted to retaliate with strikes on American warships and were again unsuccessful, but that might just be the start. With the Houthis reportedly in possession of more and more advanced technology, Saudi and Emirati oil fields well within their reach, and untold stockpiles of munitions seeming to be hidden inside Yemen, the group has all the means it could possibly want to cause real pain and panic across the global economy. There are off-ramps that the US or the Houthis could use to de-escalate in this situation, but neither side appears interested in doing that. Instead, America's Trump administration has called on Iran to rein in the Houthis and prevent any future strikes. Quoting Trump again here, "Every shot fired by the Houthis will be looked upon from this point forward as being a shot fired from the weapons and leadership of Iran, and Iran will be held responsible and suffer the consequences, and those consequences will be dire." End quote. Perhaps that was bluffed by Trump. Perhaps it wasn't. But if America's president is true to his word, then the world will find out very soon. On March the 18th, the ceasefire in Gaza broke decisively by way of crushing airstrikes from Israel. We've covered those airstrikes at length in a prior episode on this channel, so do check that out if you'd like to learn more. While those airstrikes are just hours old at the time of writing, we do know that already the Houthis have attempted to retaliate on Hamas's behalf. That day, the Israel Defense Forces shot down a ballistic missile the Houthis had fired towards central and southern Israel, with warning sirens sounding off across the nation prior to the successful interception. Just hours before Israel's airstrikes, Houthis Foreign Minister Jamal Amir told Reuters that the Houthis would not back down in the face of American pressure or because of any appeals by Iran to avoid attacks, an appeal that Iran had apparently made by way of a verbal message to a Houthi envoy in Iran to calm things down. The vow by Amir to do otherwise, we'll say again, came just hours before crippling airstrikes against the Palestinian population for whom the Houthis are trying to show support. By the time this episode comes out, we imagine that the Houthis will have launched subsequent attacks, and the United States and Israel will have responded in time. But, at least for now, that's merely speculation. Thank you for watching.